Hello and welcome. My name is Justin Bracken. I am the acquisitions editor for archaeology and anthropology here at the University of Utah Press. This is our November 2024 segment of our occasional series of author book talks, which we post to YouTube with video and post to Spotify as well as audio only segments. So I will hold some things up to the camera and I will try to remember that some of you may be listening to this audio only. And we do provide links in the episode descriptions that should lead you to the books and any other materials that we may mention. I'm here today with Aaron Wright from Archaeology Southwest, and I'll be speaking with him on a number of topics, but we'll be focused primarily upon his recent book with our press titled Sacred Southwestern Landscapes, Archaeologies of Religious Ecology. You can see it here on video, and you can find it on our website as well at uofupress.com. You've seen the book. Aaron, hello, welcome. It's great to have you here.
Good afternoon, Justin. It's great to be with you.
All right, thanks so much. So as I mentioned, Aaron's with Archaeology Southwest in Tucson, Arizona, and he works as preservation anthropologist there. And I'll provide a little background on him to kick off this conversation. Aaron got his PhD in 2011 from Washington State University. He wrote a dissertation titled Hohokam Rock Art, Ritual Practice and Social Transformation in the Phoenix Basin. Just a few years later, he published his first book with our press entitled Religion on the Rocks, Hohokam Rock Art, Ritual Practice and Social Transformation. That book was built out from his dissertation, and it won our 2012 Fowler Prize, which we award every 2 years. It's awarded by our press. And so he followed that up just this year with Sacred Southwestern Landscapes, which I showed. And I was lucky enough to work with him on that project, which was a very enlightening process for me. I think it's a great book. It was great working with him. And it's recently come to press and is available. And so we'll be discussing that today, along with some other topics, as I mentioned. So this is an edited volume as opposed to the earlier monograph. And so this book gathers contributions from an array of esteemed scholars, and they explore the manner in which religion has made itself manifest across the landscape of the North American Southwest. So in this book, as the editor, Aaron uses this collection of studies to explore the ways in which archaeological study can inform the field of religion and ecology, which according to him is, quote, an area of study and work within the environmental humanities. And in this way, he expands the relevance of his work beyond the traditional disciplinary boundaries of archaeology into the broader yet intimately related realms of the study, the details of which we'll be discussing more today. So I would like to now, at this moment, just to turn the floor over to Aaron so he can give himself an introduction and we can get this conversation started. So Aaron, please.
Great, thanks, Justin. So as Justin mentioned, I am a preservation anthropologist with the nonprofit Archaeology Southwest in Tucson. Been with the organization since 2006. They actually funded my dissertation work in the Phoenix area, which is how I moved from Puebloan archaeology into Southern Arizona archaeology. And my background, I'm from Southern Ohio, the Appalachian area. And so I bring that sort of mound builder background to the conversation as well. And growing up in that part of the country and really inspired me to pursue this kind of work.
Excellent. Thanks so much. So let's dive right into it. I would love to just discuss the book as a whole and sort of work from the big picture down, and we'll get into some of the specific chapters and contributions shortly. But just starting from the most general, I would say maybe in a sentence or two, what is it that Sacred Southwestern Landscapes aims to accomplish?
I envision three aims for this volume. And the first is it's really an introduction of archaeological research and scholarship to the environmental humanities broadly and the field of religion and ecology specifically. Secondly, it's a survey of the investigation, the archaeological exploration of sacredness in Southwestern landscapes writ large. And so we're not focusing on one particular place. So this isn't a book about Chaco Canyon per se. Chaco is featured in it, but we take a broad perspective that takes us into Mexico even. So it's a big picture perspective. And then thirdly, we really strive to give agency and voice to non-Western worldviews and ontologies, and primarily those of their indigenous communities in the Southwest.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much. And so as the project goes, can you speak a little bit to the genesis of the project, sort of what inspired it, what kicked it off, and how it all sort of came together into the volume that we have today.
Well, it's definitely grew out of a time and place where I was in my career. So about a decade ago, I started working intensively with Southwestern tribes on landscape conservation initiatives. And the field work I did for my dissertation, of course, the results I drew, religion on the rocks, for instance, um, it really demonstrated to me that there's a fundamentally different way our indigenous communities view the world that we inhabit collectively. And it shows up in the archaeological record. It's measurable, it's quantifiable in ways. And so we can approach it. And coming up in graduate school, this wasn't a subject that was emphasized, it was actually de-emphasized. Um, but recent scholarship uh, is starting to show the fruits of this type of research. And the University of Utah Press has published quite a bit of work that broaches into this realm. So it's an honor and a privilege really to work with you guys on this. And so, really just working with tribes and listening to what they have to say about the places we're trying to protect becomes clear to me that, there's a sacredness here that we can all experience. And then I run a pretty intensive field program at Archaeology Southwest, and just being in these places, these ancestral places, over and over again under different climatic conditions, we really get to see the landscape in a different way than I otherwise would. So we're really embedded in the land, and you can see it through the seasons and through the migratory patterns of birds even, right? So it's just a different way to experience place. And we all have the potential to see these places in unique and new ways the more we engage with them.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's a great description, and I do think that I've just writ large. There's been an acknowledgement within archaeological study, let's say, over the last few decades of clearly the silencing of indigenous voices, just the fact that to truly do the work we're trying to do, we have to really not just give it lip service, but actually incorporate these perspectives. And I think let's say the last few decades have shown that that's not a simple process, and it's not for maybe lack of trying, but it has deeper implications than we might realize, and that it is this ongoing process. And I think your book does a great job of pushing that forward to realistically showing, it's not a simple thing you can just slap onto a study. It's integral to everything that you do. Now, as far as the book came together, speaking, you've just about the contributing chapters and the various authors you brought here, the scholars and others. Clearly you've brought together a great group of scholars of the region. Can you speak at all to sort of the ways that the contributing authors, the various chapter authors and others have sort of shaped the book as it came together?
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to acknowledge Miles Miller's role in this. So the book came out of a seminar that we held, of course, and Miles and he's author of chapter one. We have been talking about the idea of this since 2016 when I met him. And eventually he said, "Are you going to do this or not?" And so we took the deep dive. And um, at first, it was a challenge to find like-minded scholars doing contemporary research in the Southwest on this topic. And so once we found a few, we asked around and cobbled together, a cohort of folks who are doing this kind of work, but in their own kind of ways. And I wouldn't necessarily say that they agree with what classifying our work as a dimension of religious ecology, because as I've learned putting the book together, most folks, well, I've not yet met another archaeologist who is familiar with um, the discipline of the field of religion and ecology. And so, um, but my understanding of what they're doing, it totally aligns with that and the environmental humanities broadly. And so I was fortunate enough to basically invite about a dozen scholars, and only a handful of folks declined. And we were able to um, pretty seamlessly move our work into this edited volume. And very few defectors. We picked up a couple of folks on the way and refined our thesis into what came out in print.
Great. And yeah, that's the last thing I wanted to ask, and it segued into it pretty well. Speaking of the field of religion and ecology, this is something, it's a field. It's not an academic discipline necessarily, and it's not as defined. It doesn't impose its say a theoretical framework necessarily. And maybe anything that traditionally you would use as a structuring device for an edited volume. And so it's sort of inverting, I would say, the direction of things rather than imposing a framework. It's offering new opportunities, or it's expanding the work into other realms, sort of across traditional disciplines, disciplinary boundaries and siloing. And I was, you have John Grimm and Mary Evelyn Tucker co-wrote the afterword, speaking to, addressing the matter of how this book relates to the field of religion and ecology. And I was wondering if you could just speak a little more to that connection and just to field of religion and ecology as a whole, and what drew you to it.
Sure, absolutely. So maybe 15 years or so ago, I learned of a journal called Resurgence. It's a magazine, really. It's published in Europe by the Resurgence Trust. And now it's called Resurgence and the Resurgence and Ecologist. But it was basically a forum for interdisciplinary writing and thought on ecology, ecological conservation under contemporary environmental change, etc. And so it really it showed me that there was a broad discourse going on about tackling the environmental challenges that we face through interdisciplinary scholarship. The more I looked into it, I came across concepts such as um, spiritual ecology, eco-spirituality. And it's basically there's a trend in academia where folks are starting to embrace other than science ways of trying to tackle the ecological challenges that we face. And so there's a strong faith component to it. Now, I'm not particularly faithful myself, but the arena I work in with religion and ecology in the past is it right up that way. And so most folks know this sort of field as spiritual ecology. What John Grimm and Mary Evelyn Tucker have done have really sort of formalized it. This concept of religious ecology, which is just really a synonym for spiritual ecology. And they've formalized this field, the field of religion and ecology, and provided structure to what they're trying to accomplish. And there's an activist element to it, trying to secure, clean up the environment, ensure that there's a healthy future for all of us. And the way they approach it is through the 3 R's. So there's the retrieval process, the reconstruction process, and the reevaluation process. And on from a beginning to an end, starting with the retrieval process. And in their writings, they talk about what retrieval does, and it's basically using information to learn about indigenous and non-Western faith traditions and how they interact with the environment. Basically looking for non-Western inspiration on how we can develop healthy relationships with the places that we live. And they talk about traditional environmental knowledge, oral history, texts, religious canons, etc., as sources of information, but left out of that discussion was archaeology. And as someone trained in archaeology, we're led to believe that we have a valuable source of information that can teach about the past, and here in particular, the past with regard to religious interaction with the landscape. And so I saw an opportunity, if you will, to explore this further and to demonstrate to folks in the field of religion ecology the potential contribution that archaeology has to that broader discourse. It hasn't really been fleshed out before, so this is essentially a first step. And I wanted to show archaeologists that we can do substantive, productive research in these other than science domains, if you will. There's a strong science bias in Americanist archaeology, but we all know that archaeology is much more than science. We can look at things through humanistic lenses, and that's what this book affords.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I've been caught up in that topic, or just this line of reasoning where there is absolutely a very a scientific underpinning to archaeological study in the U.S. and in the Western Hemisphere, and in general, I'd say, and it kind of by nature excludes a lot of traditional ecological knowledge. It's very hard to incorporate certain elements into it, and I, I I appreciate the idea that you can restructure, you can reframe your methodologies and your theoretical positionings to allow for this in a more meaningful way, rather than just sort of slap it as a patina over as maybe I'm not saying faux scientific study, but a study that doesn't belong in a hypothesis testing framework, let's say. And so no, I appreciated that about the framing of this and sort of thinking of different ways of approaching knowledge, of creating knowledge, I suppose. So yeah, and we'll get more into that, I think, as we get a little bit later. But I like that as a structuring framework to this. And before we get more granular with the book, I was hoping to take a step back just for another moment and go back into your position there at Archaeology Southwest, as a nonprofit, as a very public facing institution. I would say one that does a lot of outreach, both in person, with blog posts, with video series that are not so different than this talk we're having today, and just sort of your what would I say, your personal mission there as a preservation archaeologist.
Sure, absolutely. Archaeology Southwest, we're based in Tucson, but we have tentacles throughout the greater Southwest. And we took the name from our magazine. We're best known to a broader audience by our magazine, Archaeology Southwest magazine. And we used to be called the Center for Desert Archaeology. So if any folks have memories of that organization, we are the same. So there at Archaeology Southwest, we advocate for the preservation of heritage places, and that's our mission. And we do that through essentially four lines. One is the actual preservation of places. Um, we do research in support of the preservation of places. We have outreach, which involves communicating the importance of the places that we preserve. And then we have a dimension of advocacy. And advocacy broadly, but really we're talking about the advocacy for indigenous sovereignty and native rights to place. And that's what guides the organization. Now, my role there, I'm a preservation anthropologist or archaeologist, and staff here generally fall into one of those domains. I'm predominantly a researcher here at the organization, but my research, I do my research with the objective of garnering conservation successes for heritage places. And so I have one foot in research and I have one foot in preservation. And I use the research to earn conservation successes. And so in that capacity, I've been working for about a decade now on the Great Bend of the Gila National Monument Campaign. I've worked on the successful Viaquame Monument Campaign that was established last year. I'm presently working on a project for Petroglyph National Monument, Indigenous Cultural Landscape Report. So here in my capacity, I basically use my skills and my experience and my platform to advocate for and garner protections for ancestral lands. And of course, working with tribes is a vital part of that.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much. I getting back to the book then, and I think we don't have the time here to speak to every chapter in depth, but I have a few that I've sort of picked out and I would like to hopefully discuss a little bit. And just going back to the general coverage, sacred Southwestern landscapes, the contributions in the book, they cover a fairly wide geographic area, where we see what I found really helpful. Looking back at the book after a little time away from it, from my part of helping get it to press to now months later, while having it as a book in hand. On page 2 of it, on figure 1.1, for anyone that does get a copy of the book. There's a great that figure overlays the chapter authors' names on a map of the Southwest, or specifically the region of interest being studied here, which I can't think of many other examples of books where I've seen that, and I found that to be very helpful as especially in an edited volume like this, where you get a sense, you can always refer back and say, oh yes, we're talking about Western Arizona versus over in Sonora or Chihuahua. And so, yeah, the Borderlands region is sort of the focus here, covering New Mexico and Arizona, as well as Sonora and Chihuahua over the border in Mexico. And as you mentioned as well on page 7, this is the focus, the connection here to the field of religion and ecology is on, quote, the partial retrieval of religious ecologies, going, of course, according to the 3 R's there. And retrieval, again, sitting alongside evaluation and reconstruction. And so in this partial retrieval, actually, before we get into the books, yeah, could you, when you mentioned partial retrieval, and I think there's an important qualification in saying that, and which of course is related directly to how much, well, appropriateness, I suppose, in terms of what we're actually able to say about the people from the past or these cultural uh, just these groups, I suppose, or their cultural manifestations. Can you speak to, yeah, just to especially as you refer to it as partial retrieval? I'm interested to hear more about that.
Yeah, it's an emphasis on essentially the limitations of archaeology. And so we're dealing with an incomplete record, right? We're just dealing with the material record, and there's a lot of assumptions and interpretations that go into that. So it's a fragmented record, if you will, subject to ambiguity and contestation of interpretation. And that's one domain. And another domain is that it will always be incomplete as long as our indigenous colleagues are left out of the conversation. And so while this book makes strides in that regard, we have a lot of work still to do. And so as long as they are not equal players in the dialogue, it's inherently incomplete.
Thank you. All right. So with that sort of overall framing, I think we've touched on a lot of important points, but let's get into some of the chapters. And I was hoping to start with, we'll go sequentially. I think that makes the most sense as the volume is well structured in this regard. And we'll start with chapter 2. And this is Miles Miller's chapter titled Bringing the Landscape Home, the Materiality of Pilgrimage in the Jornada and Mimbres Mogollon Settlement. And in this, I'll just sort of introduce the basics. He mentions early on that excavations at Pueblo Bonito, back as far as 1896, they turned up a deposit of, quote, over 1,000 cephalopod and brachiopod fossils, over 300 crinoid stems, the majority of which were coated in red and yellow pigment. And mixed into that deposit were quartz and calcite crystals, smooth water-worn pebbles, chalcedony concretions, ores and minerals, petrified wood, colored clays, etc. And so as Miles states in the chapter, these are pieces of places, or, quote, material metaphors and symbolic representations of sacred places and cosmovisions embedded in and reflected by those landscapes. And my summary for myself that I wrote down was just that these are material manifestations of movement, which is sort of by its nature ephemeral, but you have it here, made material, and of course, as archaeologists, we love the material. So I like this as an introduction to this concept of religion on the landscape, of physically moving objects from one place to another, as whether it's more than a souvenir, certainly, but as a record of these movements and their importance. And I thought this is a good, beyond the standard introduction, this was a good first chapter within their first contributed chapter within the volume. And I was going to turn it over to you and get your thoughts on his contributions here.
Yeah, absolutely. It definitely grounds the volume up front and center. And the strength of Miles' work is that it's comprehensive. So it's data loaded, it's rich. It's based on a lot of field experience of his, as well as consultations with indigenous communities. He works in the private sector on federal projects, and so there's a lot of tribal collaboration and consultation that goes on in his work. So it's very informed in that regard. And it doesn't feature into this chapter per se, but other works of his, recent works of his, so he actually charts out the movement of these materials from point A to point B across the landscape through very ephemeral archaeological signatures. And so this is a good contribution to his other work on that. and it sets up the concept of pieces of places. Now, folks are probably aware of that in some regard. It's fairly common point of discussion anymore. It comes out of Richard Bradley's work in Europe, and then was picked up predominantly by Ruth Van Dyke for Chaco. It's published extensively on the subject, and the idea proliferates throughout the volume after Miles's chapter. Some folks refer to the pieces of place terminologies, others it's more of a looked at through a semiotic perspective. And that's essentially what it is. It's a version of semiosis where objects have meaning because of the places they're associated with. So they're essentially indexical objects. And this framework really helps explain, at least to me, a lot of the dimensions of the archaeological record that folks in the past have struggled with. And this sort of dichotomy between um, the functional and the non-functional when it comes to archaeological materials. These things that seem to be out of place or insignificant are the complete opposite when they're understood through an ontological perspective. And Miles' work does great. He's great with this. The cephalopods. It's pretty amazing. I wasn't aware of those, and I have not found those in southern Arizona. And the quartz crystals, the rosy, smoky quartz crystals. So, but a lot of the groundwork that Miles lays out, especially with the cave shrine deposits here, it's a repeated phenomenon across the broader Southwest, if not the Western North America, largely. I see elements of it in the Great Basin, Southern California as well. And so he's really touching on sort of broadly held indigenous worldviews with regard to sacredness in the landscape. And yeah, it's great to work with him.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah.
So yeah, jumping from there, I was gonna jump just to chapter 5, and this is Julio Amador Besch, Sacred Places and Rock Art Sites in the Sonoran Desert, taking us over the border into what's now Mexico. And this one, chapter 5, so it's still fairly early in the volume, and he's focused on the trincheras tradition down in northwest Mexico, but he's really looking more deeply at sort of the definition of a place as sacred and this concept of the sacred, which is always going to be tricky. It's always going to have different implications for different people. But we do. I mean, this is an important part of archaeological research, or at least some big facet of it is looking at the everyday, the domestic, the quotidian versus the heightened and the sacred, and how separate those things are, and how we can see them. And obviously, it carries implications for, say, NAGPRA or things like that. There are legal implications of such considerations if you look at it broadly. And so he's looking at landscape, and I liked how he relates the human body and narratives that people have. Let's see what else: acoustics, proximity to valued natural resources, rock imagery, which we'll talk about more, astronomical orientations, and just there's clearly not one easy answer for any of this. It's not a formula that we can apply to these, but there are ways of approaching it, and there are different facets that recur over and over again when we look at the concepts of the sacred in the landscape, in a place, in a constructed environment, however you want to look at it. And he applies these two Cerro de Trincheras, and a monumental site planned and functionally was used every day for domestic use, but also adhering to cosmovision's religious frameworks and sacred layouts, along with containing a lot of petroglyphs. So I'll turn it over to you then for your thoughts on this chapter, which I thought was another good sort of meditation on what an investigation into what the sacred means and how we can see it in the landscape.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate this chapter because it provides a methodology, if you will, to approach the subject instead of just assuming it or doing a direct historical approach where you're applying contemporary indigenous views on the past. So it's more methodological in a sense, and it incorporates things like geomorphology and stuff. So this chapter was well received by the reviewers, And it was great to work with Julio on this. I work in Southern Arizona, and so I see a lot of parallels, of course, with what's going on the other side of the border. And I invited Julio to this project after seeing him present on this, I believe in 2016 at the SAAs. And it was just, wow, I got to work with this guy and make the sacred landscape things a reality. So um, I'm glad we're able to feature a Mexican scholar. He's not English is not his primary language, and so I've been pretty much his research has been under my radar. But having worked with him, I've learned that he's a pretty prolific scholar. Just publishes in Spanish. He's written books on rock imagery, Tohono O'odham ethnography, the integration of those concepts, and so yeah, this book or this chapter in the book is quite aligned with my two chapters that precede it and are right is right after it, and so I think it blends well together. And it's refreshing to have I guess a different voice on Trincheras, um, one that entertains the notion of sacredness in the land, and to hear about these archaeological features that we read about, but to hear sort of more expanded understandings of them in their broader landscape context. So, for example, the structures on top of these hills and their, um, I guess, astronomical alignments, if you will. That's pretty convincing work that he's did in collaboration with his students, and um, so it's great. It dovetails well with the one of the earlier chapters from Pakime, where they're also aligning the built environment with horizon markers and celestial alignments. And again, it's just a broader pattern that we hear about from places like Chaco Canyon, but the more we study it across the Southwest, it's not just there.
Mm, yeah, very nice. And so building on what you said, you mentioned that your chapter sort of sandwich his. Moving on to the next one, then chapter 6 is you with a few others, and this is chapter 6, an ecology of the Patayan human dreamland. And so in here, and I'll let you speak mostly to it. I don't want to step on your toes here, but we're moving more to the western portion of the study along the Colorado and Gila rivers, and the human cultural landscape along the lower Gila River in Arizona as the sort of primary focus. Lots of petroglyphs in the region, as noted, as appeared in Julio's chapter. And I was wondering if you could speak. I have a quote here from it, but I can ignore that for now. Speaking to the term dreamland and sort of how you use that as a structuring device for this chapter.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's somewhat of a play on words, of course. Book being about landscapes. Now, but dreamland, obviously you have to read the chapter to understand it, but it's basically it ties into human spirituality and ontology, and so um, the ethnographic record is quite clear for river human communities that their spirituality occurred in a dream state, and the dreaming that they did. Essentially, their spirits would leave their bodies and travel around the landscape and acquire spiritual knowledge from actors and agents in certain landforms. And what's maybe hard for a Western mind to wrap around is that these aren't just dreams. Even though this takes place while dreaming, these actions and events actually take place in the material world. So there are people's spirits flying around, moving around the world that we inhabit as they visit these places and interact with agents that we can't see. And so with that sort of ontology, um, I believe it helps explain a lot of the previously inexplainable aspects of Patayan and human archaeological landscape. Uh, there's a lot of rock imagery, of course, but then there's very enigmatic ground figures that folks talk about being tied with human spirituality and cosmology, but it's not quite clear. And as I talk about in the chapter, which focuses on three domains: trails, ground figures or geoglyphs, and rock imagery. In the past, these subjects have been treated in isolation from one another. Uh, but the work that I've been doing on the lower Gila River since 2016 approximately, taking a landscape perspective, a holistic perspective, and integrating ethnographic information and human ontology, um, they're they're all tied together, and you get a better understanding of the parts when you look at them as a whole. And this chapter, I was fortunate to work with Lori Kachora. He's a elder with the Fort Yuma Quetzon tribe, and he's written about human spirituality. He's a trained archaeologist. Um, so it was great to get his perspective on it. And it just sort of clicks for me. When I first started working on the Gila River, Lower Gila, I was just amazed, felt incredibly out of place. But over the years, it just sort of was like a puzzle that fell into place. Um, and Yeah, I think we're on to something in the chapter. We may not have it specifically correct, but this was the aha moment for that research. Now we wrote the draft of this chapter 4 years ago,
Mm,
uh, 4.5 years ago. So I've learned a lot more since. This is our first significant publication on the Lower Gila River Ethnographic and Archaeological Project, and hopefully, there will be more coming out. But this was a foundation for some things that are making their ways um, through the scholarship right now.
excellent. Well, thank you. Yeah, and so jumping from there, we're getting into sort of the second half of the book here. I wanted to jump to chapter 8, which was Sean Field's timber importation as pilgrimage to Chaco Canyon. And I just, as I recall, and this is, I should look at my notes, but this is a while ago. But I remember this one being very popular among the reviewers, and this deals with well, as you can imagine, the act of bringing timbers into Chaco Canyon, which they needed a lot, and there aren't a lot around. And so you have, this sort of this idea of labor as ritualized, as sacred. You have communal efforts, and this really, to me, touched on concepts I've considered a lot before in terms of, we look back at a finished product and we look at labor and we look at organization of labor, and we tend to think backward from it's teleological, which it is in a way, looking at the finished product. But there is this active nature of constructing something like this. And there are people living together in communities. There are, as explained here, these parties going out to obtain these large timbers, and how it evolves through time. And I think I have it here as page 115. Timber importation rapidly shifted from a practice of material dependency to one of religious and symbolic significance. And just the ways that actions, that labor and things that are indirectly materialized do really bring together communities and form new bonds and form new communities of practice, let's say. And so in the way that it's traced out quantitatively here, it explains it, and it establishes the reality of the past reality of these groups and of this ritual in a pretty well-founded manner, a well-constructed study, I would say. So I'll turn it to you for your comments on this one.
Yeah, I appreciate this chapter because it's perhaps the most traditional from an archaeological perspective. And so what Sean has done is in my opinion, he's applied a behavioral ecology model to spirituality. And so
Mm,
the modeling of the energetics behind the labor and the importation of the timbers, et cetera, is quite fascinating to use those sort of nomothetic quantitative models to talk about something much deeper and ethereal. And his work reminds us of the complex nature of pilgrimage. And um, pilgrimage comes up a lot in the literature on Chaco. It's often discussed as pilgrimages to Chaco. This is a reversal. This is a pilgrimage from Chaco to the outlying domains of the horizon, which I talk about several places in the book. But if you're in Chaco Canyon looking out onto the horizon, you're going to see the Chusca Mountains. That's the edge of that view shed, or that visual world, if you will. And so people ventured out, dangerous undertakings, labor intensive, harvested these trees, brought them back. And I believe, as Kurt Anschwitz talks about in the discussion at the end of the book, it's really like you can't have a center without an edge. And I
mm,
think this chapter really demonstrates that, where Chaco is often considered a center. But critical to that center was the engagement with the edge. those being the mountains on the horizons and the timbers brought. And of course, we have pieces of places again comes up, and it's a it's the scientific formula that Sean uses, but the implications are incredibly humane.
Mm,
And so in reading it, you can learn about how these individuals who went on these pilgrimages who remain unnamed to us, but their labor, their sweat uh, went into building Chaco. Chaco is just not buildings that built themselves, right?
mm,
People invested themselves into the creation of these places, and they had relationships.
mhm.
That's what the book is really about: relationships with place and landscape.
Yeah, absolutely. I have two more I'd like to talk about, and it makes sense to talk about them separately, but in both cases, it brings the discussion more to the present. And I'll start. So it's chapters 12 and 13. And so chapter 12, let's just stick with that one on its own. This is Sylvia Rodriguez and her procession and sacred landscape among Hispanic Catholics in New Mexico. And I think this chapter is a great shift in perspective that is very germane to the overall discussion. And just looking at, first she says in the first part, she examines the northern New Mexican folk Catholic tradition of religious procession. And the second part, quote, steps back from the present to consider how processions changed over the course of 4 centuries. And as with anything, you can't ever just directly assume by seeing what's in the present that you can, I guess, extrapolate, use that to project backward in the past in any sort of direct historical approach. But there are there are practices that evolve, as we're talking about here, and of course, all the a lot of the past, a lot of the chapters that deal with archaeological materials, things from the deeper past, dealt with movement across the landscape, dealt with processions or pilgrimages like the timber pilgrimage. And so in this chapter, she gets into how these formalized institutional practices of pilgrimage, I'm not sure if this is a direct quote, but slowly but consistently are taken over as folk traditions across about 4 centuries. And yeah, I was just wondering if you could speak to this and sort of how it relates to the overall goals of the book, and how it relates to especially the studies of earlier times, the archaeological studies versus this one here.
One of the goals was to not get bogged down in archaeological data, which I think we succeeded at, but Sylvia's contribution is really critical to that. So she's not an archaeologist. She's a cultural anthropologist and works with these folk communities in northern New Mexico, of course. And um, her narrative is basically a reminder that um, these religious traditions and these relationships with place are not static. They're dynamic. They respond to perturbations, etc., and they're constantly being renewed. And they may not be renewed in a way that transforms them in radical ways, but it's the renewal process that we see, and that's what ritual engagement um, requires, and is this renewal, this redoing, and the processional discussion that she provides is um, really illustrative of that process, and is a reminder for how, when we think about archaeologically, that again, it's a fragmented record. And Sylvia talks about the distinction between hardware and software, these metaphors
Mm,
essentially for the data sets. Basically, she's commenting that the book is predominantly about archaeologists who work with hardware. Her contribution is working with software. And it's when you have the two together, which we try to do in the volume, um, it's more informed than either alone. And it was great to get her contribution on basically non-Indigenous communities
mm.
in the Southwest that really fly under the radar of archaeological scholarship. And but they're an important dimension of the cultural landscape.
Great. And I think following this was chapter 13, and this is Darrell Wilkinson and Severin Fowles' Land of Reenchantment, the Archaeology of Esotericism in New Mexico. And these to me form a very, very solid sort of winding down of the book. Not even winding down though, because it's a whole new set of perspectives and moving more toward the present. I in rereading this chapter, I I was taken by the cleverness of the title, and engaging both with New Mexico's nickname, the Land of Enchantment, as pushed up against Weber's Disenchantment of the Modern World, and looking specifically to New Mexico, and I would say in a lot of ways the impact of archaeological study on the present world, people's actions, people's beliefs, and people's attachments to certain spirituality, even whether it's new agey or other Kokopelli style things. The modern world sort of imposing its meaning of the past and incorporating it, appropriating it in many ways. And we see this as also as a matter of, I guess, continuity. We can look at past cultures that similarly brought in objects, beliefs of other groups of past peoples to them and incorporated it into their own, and had that shape their worldview and belief systems and things. And I just got stuck on the it's figure 13.5, an evocative image of a modern petroglyph made by somebody in the style that they see around there, of in the Rio Grande Gorge, and it depicts a rendering of the Venus of Dolní Vestanitsa in a southwestern style, which is very much whatever archaeological studies put out in the world, it's sort of doubling back and becoming its own new thing, and hard to assign values to it other than maybe defacement of certain areas, but compelling to me at least in terms of what this has all become, and just this concept of esotericism. So I'll turn this one over to you. I didn't really make a good point there, but just sort of introduce the chapter and how this chapter plays into everything else as well.
Well, I'm really glad this chapter showed up. It wasn't part of the original seminar. Really fortunate to have it, and it's really pretty much a capstone for the volume in several ways. It's obviously the most recent study. So this is archaeology of the contemporary, if you will. So basically communities in and around the Taos area building archaeological landscapes embedded in their spiritual expressions, if you will, through ground, rock creations, petroglyphs, etc. There's a dimension of ethnography brought in. So Sev and Daryl have worked in this area and communicated with some of the actors creating these things, and so it's it's a really interesting perspective on the intersection of archaeology and religion and ecology, in the sense that the field of religion and ecology and the three R's: retrieval, reevaluation, and reconstruction. And as I discuss in the preface of the volume, I'm apprehensive to get into the realm of reconstruction. That's the idea of basically reformulating religious traditions to tackle contemporary ecological problems.
Mm.
Obviously, there's ethical issues with that. But here we've got an archaeological case study of people essentially doing that.
Mm-hmm.
So these New Age communities are basically building religions out of indigenous and pagan religions to suit their immediate needs, some of which is responding to environmental and ecological crisis. And so I just thought it was a really fine example of how archaeology and religious ecology can intersect in interesting and surprising ways. And I think they did it's remarkable that they had the foresight doing the field work to keep track of all this information and actually do a piece of scholarship on it. I think most field archaeologists will come across random modern shrines, if you will, or offerings at places and just sort of blow them off. This chapter really looks at them anthropologically, and we learn about what's going on, and yeah, making archaeology relevant to the contemporary scene. Right.
Absolutely. So yeah, and that's the last chapter I wanted to discuss. So, and thank you for all that. I think in closing on the book itself, I was curious about your thoughts now that it's out. It exists as an object in the world, and it will hopefully reach its audience and create new conversations. And I wanted to get your thoughts on the book now moving forward from here, and the discussions you're hoping that it spurs, or other hopes for it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, my primary aim was to to build a bridge between archaeology and the environmental humanities. And um, I feel that this book accomplished that. It's a step towards that direction. The release of this book was featured on the Yale Forum of Religion and Ecology. That's the organization founded by John Grimm and Mary Evelyn Tucker. It was actually they operate it or direct it and manage it. It was founded by the United Nations, and it's been under the auspices of Yale University since 2006. It was founded in 1998. But anyway, this work is getting traction in that domain, and so that was exciting to see.
Mhm.
One of my goals, of course, as I mentioned, is to make archaeology relevant to contemporary issues, conservation issues primarily. And so we're making strides in that regard. And I think the coverage is so broad that if someone is working in the Southwest or just has an interest in the Southwest, you're going to take something away from this book. There's going to be something that resonates with you if you're writing a chapter on something or whatnot. But even just topically, the concepts and the methods and the case studies are applicable to a global audience. And hopefully, I'd really like to see others sort of move this discussion in unique ways, um, starting a conversation, if you will.
Great. Excellent. So I wanted to take the last few minutes here and just move away from the book itself, which I think we've covered in good detail, and I was very glad with our conversation. I'm very happy with it. I wanted to shift. This is a topic that you've written on in ways I'll introduce, but it's about the term rock art as the sort of go-to phrase for rock imagery, petroglyphs and pictographs, whatever phrase we would choose for it. And this is something that I know it's a debate that's been going on for a long time, and it's one that to us as a press sort of came to a head in the last several months, and we started looking into it. And I was mostly unaware. In my head, I would say I had considered rock art to be sort of the established established neutral term for just this imagery, and I didn't realize that there was not just a sense of perhaps inaccuracy among descendant groups, descendant communities, but offense, that it's actually in some ways could be taken offensively or as just as a problematic term. And I thought it was at worst neutral, and I didn't realize it was something that could actually cause harm. And when I started looking into this more and trying to figure out how to approach this topic as a press, I came across your blog post from Preservation Archaeology. It was written last year, March 2023, and the title is "Why I No Longer Call It Art." And that was one of the few resources that I was able to come across quickly. I know there are others out there, but one of the few that really addressed it so directly. And would you, I guess to start, would you be able to just summarize the main points that you made in that blog post? Not to put you on the spot.
Yes, certainly. So that I wrote that blog post in advance of the 2023 conference for the American Rock Art Research Association that was held in Tucson, Arizona, and I was the local chair of that. And I've been struggling with the terminology for quite some time now. And of course, I've used it in the past. It's featured in the title of my 2014 volume with the press, and but it really dovetails with the previous discussion we were having about the book. And when I started working intensively with tribes and listening to them and talking with them, it became increasingly clear to me that this was a problem. This was potentially an issue. Um, but I wasn't aware of that until I actually started talking to tribes and asking them pretty directed questions about it, and developing those relationships where they felt comfortable to share these perspectives, right? Um, I've not yet encountered a situation where a tribal community member has said, "Don't use that word."
Mm,
It's always in response to me asking it what's appropriate and whatnot, and I guess mutual power, mutual power discussions, if you will. And I've come to refrain from using that word, and it basically comes out of the requests from the tribes that I work with that I not use that word. But then also conceptually, I think it's a problematic concept. And in 2016, so again, going back to that date, we put out an issue of Archaeology Southwest magazine that focused on rock imagery across the Southwest. I was the editor in there. I wrote a little piece on the problem with calling these manifestations art. And, you know, we basically, the language we use is conditions how we view the world, right? There's a psychological element behind it. And when we use concept like ruins, for example, it implies certain things that aren't true. We know that they're not true because after talking with communities who hold heritage values of these places, they're not ruins. They're still active parts of the lived landscape. They're just not inhabited anymore. And so, of course, the terminology we use biases how we view things. And so if we or if I call something art, I'm emphasizing one element at the detriment of other elements, for example. And so, can these things be studied as art? That's been the argument that advocates for the term have said, or have supported. Uh, yes. Does it need to be called art? Not necessarily, especially when people take offense to it. And so since the blog post, it spurred some discussion. There is um, a movement within some sectors to move away from the terminology rock art. When I was doing the research for this, obviously the state of Utah Historic Preservation Office has moved away from the term. And of course, there's a lot of rock imagery in Utah. So they inspired me to really look into alternatives. And so in response to the blog post, I can talk a little bit about the article that we've discussed. Having discussion with the press here, early 2024, I believe, how the discussion was how broadly shared amongst our indigenous colleagues is this sentiment, right? I can only, at the time, I could only speak from my personal interactions with a handful of communities in Southern Arizona that I work with. And so the idea was let's do a survey. And so since that discussion, we did a survey. So I sent a survey to over 400 tribes this summer. I got about an 8% return rate, so not great, but nothing to be shy about either. And the sentiment was definitely skewed in one direction. It wasn't unanimous, but there's definitely a strong preference against the term rock art. And so we decided to publish the results of this study. We actually did it's a two-part study. We looked at the historical terminology used to describe rock imagery. And one of the arguments that proponents will share is that, well, it's the established term. It's the term everyone uses. It's always been used, etc. And that's actually not true. That's a myth. The term rock art doesn't show up in the literature until 1946. And it's a fairly obscure article. It wasn't until the 1960s that it becomes popularized. There are a number of books that were published through Berkeley at the time that really popularized the term rock art. So we reviewed the literature, the peer-reviewed literature since 1865. And so rock art doesn't show up until 1946. There are a lot of other terms that were in use that continue to be used. Petroglyph and pictograph, for example, rock painting, rock engraving, etc. And so rock art is not the unanimous term for it. And actually, those other terms remain salient today. And so our argument was, why do we need a new term or an offensive term when we have an array of older, more established terms that we can use? And we don't necessarily need to get rid of the term rock art, because there are some tribes, our other dimension of the study from our survey, we learned that some tribes prefer that term. And so the gist, the takeaway is that as scholars, as researchers, it behooves us to work with the indigenous communities in our area, especially those that ascribe heritage to the places we're talking about, to work with them to develop appropriate, language, if you will, that respects their perspectives, conveys information in a factual, accurate way. And so it's not going to, there's no need for a universal term. There never has been one, and there probably shouldn't be, because this is a global phenomenon, um, occurs on every continent that humans have existed. And so there's going to be lots of different ways to talk about this. And having a unitary term really prohibits our ability, in my opinion, to fully explore and appreciate the diversity and the significance of these images.
Absolutely. And no, you touched on a lot of important points that I've considered, including the fact that you wrote the blog post in anticipation of the RRA meeting, which, breaking out the acronym, it stands for the American Rock Art Resource Association. So it's a term that has embedded itself very deeply in a lot of institutions. Uh, I wanted to just follow up quickly, just and I do want to speak too about multivocality and the difference in opinion that you encountered in the survey. But before I get to that, I just wanted to clarify a little bit about where the sense of offense comes from, or even inaccuracy, because I feel like if I'm understanding it correctly, it comes from a sense that this plays, of course, into the definition of what art is as well, but maybe a sense of its function, and a debate about aesthetics versus maybe storytelling. Is that does that touch a little bit on where the divide is occurring, or where the issue is arising from?
Yeah, it's complicated and multifaceted. We asked our survey respondents to, share their sentiments, and some were longer than their
Mm,
descriptions. But um, basically, if I could summarize it simplistically, calling it art is a form of appropriation, essentially.
mm,
So, in what's been shared by the respondents was that art is a Eurocentric concept.
mm,
Not that folks don't have art, but the way art is used in the English language is not how they see these markings. And these markings are much more than art.
mm,
They have a practical purpose, they have a significance beyond the aesthetic. And by insistently calling it art, it emphasizes a Eurocentric value and view over those of the descendant communities whose ancestors made it. And
mm,
so um, yeah, it's essentially it's a power dynamic,
mm.
right, over cultural heritage.
Would you associate that at all, timing wise? It seems that you mentioned that rock art comes into use in the '60s, and that would be sort of on the same wave as the rise of processualism or the new archaeology under Binford. Like, with that, let's say, classification, compartmentalization. I don't know what the right word is here, but that sense of labeling it and sort of isolating it as an entity. Would you relate that to the current trends at the time? Do you think it is a sort of a carryover from the rise of processualism, or is it more than that, or is it more
I
complicated than that?
I believe so, but it's again, I think it's a complex process that played out that others are going to have probably different but
Mm,
comparable views on. So, in my study of the history of rock imagery research in the U.S., it was actually a hot topic
mm,
in the early days of archaeology until about the 1930s.
mm,
And Julian Stewart, the father of cultural ecology, nomotheticist to the core,
mm,
his early work was on basically broad scale comparisons of rock imagery across the West. Uh, and he wrote a couple of things in the late 1920s and early 30s, and he eventually came to the conclusion that um, the study of rock imagery was useless because you couldn't be interpreted.
mm,
And he said that the indigenous people didn't know what it meant, and therefore it had no scientific value. Uh, Of course, his primary interest was on the interpretation of the imagery, which is only one particular way to look at this material
Sure.
class. There's other ways to approach the subject matter, but he wasn't using more contemporary theoretical domains. And so when he came to that impasse, he just moved on and said it was essentially a waste of time.
Mm,
And so, of course, his work presaged processualism. And so with the rise of processualism, you had the basically the diminishment of archaeological phenomena that didn't serve some sort of function with regard to reproduction of the species. So food, shelter, energy expenditure, etc. Anything else was skewed, but it had to be dealt with, especially with the
mhm.
rise of cultural resource management, which came up shortly
That's
thereafter,
true. Yeah,
essentially
around the same
around the
time.
same time. So
Hmm.
um, by classifying it as art, it was one way to talk about it, to acknowledge that it exists. So you're in compliance with, laws and ethics, etc. But it's something other. It's something that's we don't need to worry about because we'll never understand it. Its only purpose is to look good. The indigenous communities don't know what it means. They're not telling us what it means. Uh, so I definitely believe that has something to do with it as well.
Sure.
And then there's another dimension to it where um, so the sort of primitivism that came to rise in the mid to early to mid 20th century, where at the same time that you have nomothetic processual archaeology eschewing rock imagery, you have this other domain where people are starting to fetishize indigenous iconography, and so now you start to get at the cave paintings in Europe. Are movies are being made about them. You get the commodification of indigenous rock imagery, and so this whole other sector forms that appreciates the rock imagery, but they're not archaeologists
Hmm.
by and large. And that situation really predicated where we're at today, where
Yeah.
if you go to a conference, any number of the rock imagery conferences, the membership of these organizations and the audience is archaeologists are in the minority.
Hmm.
It's
Hmm.
people from other fields, etc. So um, yeah, we're making amends. We're moving towards the integration of rock imagery back into the discipline. The collaboration with tribal communities is a significant part of that. So
Absolutely.
with the rock imagery, that's something that they value highly. And we see this interesting dichotomy between archaeologists and tribes when it comes to this subject. Um, for a long time, archaeologists have ignored rock imagery, not valued it. I talk with tribal communities, it's one of the things they value the most. These are messages from their ancestors. How could that not be valuable?
Hmm.
But then also what we call it, we can get back to the terminological issue. So
Hmm.
in our study of the labels, the least popular for archaeologists was some of the least popular were rock writing and rock
Hmm.
inscriptions. Those are unpopular terms for rock imagery. But when we ask the tribes what they prefer, those are the two terms that they prefer the most. So
Interesting.
this is a complete inverse in values on this material. And hopefully this discussion we can get to a more equitable place that works for everybody.
It's great. Yeah. No, it is providing that history, I think, really opens it up for me in understanding, especially the multivocality issue. And I think it's easy just to scrape the surface of this issue and say, okay, you don't let, rock art's not the right term. So what's the better one? What's the one that will make everyone happy? And the answer is there is no term that's going to appeal to everybody. And when you consider the history of how various groups and just groups of people have interacted with it, you can understand that maybe the tribes around Sedona, Arizona are going to interact with it differently than groups in Utah versus groups in other parts. And they have a different recent history with it. They have a different way that the work of their ancestors has been appropriated or, kind of absorbed by other new age people, others, popular media, Von Däniken's, whoever. And it's interesting to consider that, yeah, you're going to get a number of opinions on the matter, and they might be mutually exclusive, and that as you got into, there's just not one term for it. And that is interesting to me, that I think, to my mind, the phrase rock art was sort of an attempt to be value neutral, and was considered as that for a long time, and without considering that it's applying a very Western, not European, non-Indigenous, whatever it might be, concept to a body of work that doesn't really fit. And I think the survey that you've conducted, to me, just seems absolutely the right approach if we want to know if we want to get an answer on this and understand why it's offensive and what might be a better term, what better way than to solicit opinions. And they're not going to all coalesce. They're going to go off in different directions for any number of reasons. And I appreciate your work on that. That's something that I saw in the abstract as useful, and you brought it to reality. So I appreciate your work on that. Thank you.
Yeah, hopefully we can have that paper out early part of 2025.
Excellent.
So that everyone can consult it and use it. But yeah, it's basically just reemphasizes that we have to keep our Indigenous colleagues as part of the conversation. We got into the situation because we never worked with them in the past. So we have a very skewed view of their heritage. And this is just part of a broader dialogue that we're having in the discipline, moving away from offensive terminology towards inclusive terminology. And exciting times.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, just to bring it to a close, let's moving back to the book or your work or however you want to do. What's coming up next? What are you working on now, and what are you going to publish on next?
Well, I have a number of projects going on, field projects and then writing projects. I do have a couple of book projects in the works. The
Great.
Lower Gila Archaeological Ethnographic Project, the sort of synthetic results of that, that hopefully I'll get wrapped up in a matter of years. But my most immediate book project is I'm actually collaborating with Julio Amador Besch, author of Chapter 5 in this volume. He's my co-editor. We received a grant to hold a seminar on basically rock imagery of the Sonoran Desert, and the tentative title of the volume was going to be Picturing Perseverance, Rock Imagery and Indigenous Cultural Resilience Across the Sonoran Desert. And so we'll be meeting next fall for a seminar with chapters in hand to facilitate a quick turnaround. But essentially the volume is again, it has multiple aims. In one regard, it's an atlas, if you will. So we'll have pretty synthetic aerial coverage of different parts of the Sonoran Desert, the rock imagery in these places. We have 5 U.S. scholars, 6 Mexican scholars, and 6 indigenous scholars contributing. So it's a multinational endeavor. And so at one level, it's an atlas. At a deeper, more maybe meaningful level, it's an exposition on how contemporary indigenous communities draw heritage value out of these places, and basically how the rock imagery perpetuates their existence on the landscape in a particular way. And so very excited to work on this project. And other than that, there's a couple little papers here and there, but
Great. Well, that sounds really compelling. I'm excited to see that once it comes out, and all the other stuff you're working on. So I'll just say thank you, Aaron. This has been great. I really appreciate you meeting with me here today, and discussing your book. And again, for everyone listening or watching, Sacred Southwestern Landscapes, edited by Aaron Wright. This is a great collection. It's out in the world now. You can find it by Googling the title or going to uofupress.com, where it is available for sale on our website. Thanks so much, Aaron.
thank you, Justin.